Jennifer, what are you hearing about the Métis Nation Saskatchewan pulling out of the MNC, the Métis National Council?
It's actually really interesting in the Prince Albert area. Obviously, we have a very high Métis population. I come from a Métis family on my mom's side. And so my grandma's been heavily involved in our Métis local here. And I know that over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of conversations with the Métis folks, especially across Saskatchewan, on what this actually looks like, because we've seen a lot of changes over the last few years, especially when we start talking about what they are calling modern treaty and, you know, their right to sovereignty and stuff like that. And what I'm hearing is that it's very, very complicated. I think there's some discrepancies with the Métis Nation of Ontario and their citizenship, and a lot of people may be wrongfully claiming Métis heritage. So I think for people in Saskatchewan right now, there's a lot of confusion and people not really understanding what this means in the future and what's happening with the Métis National Council.
What is really going on here, Nigan? Why is this once formidable Métis National Council apparently falling apart?
On one level, it's very ironic. Back in the 1980s, when there was constitutional struggles for Indigenous rights, which of course involves Métis rights or impacts Métis rights, members of the Manitoba Métis Federation and what would eventually become, or what was already, a growing, burgeoning national movement of Métis people were going around the country talking to people from different elements of the country, saying, let's go to Ottawa, let's work together, let's create some sort of unity. And then, of course, got many inroads as a result, recognizing Métis people within the constitutional definition of Indigenous peoples, or Aboriginal peoples at the time. And so therefore opened up the conversation on Métis rights. But then zoom ahead now several decades later. And the problem, of course, is that Métis people who are outside of the Red River Métis, the historical nation, a sovereign, autonomous community that have their own culture, tradition, language, coming from the Red River region and spreading throughout northwestern Ontario, Alberta, Saskatchewan. That is the Red River Métis Nation. And so people who have ancestral connections out in Ontario and east and even as far as British Columbia, coming from other nations, those are mixed blood people or ancestral Indigenous peoples, but they are not Red River Métis. And so that's where the big schism comes from, especially in Ontario, where the Métis Nation of Ontario for years has recognized communities that have not been recognized by the Red River Métis in Manitoba. It's now Saskatchewan. And so for the Saskatchewan and Alberta were kind of holdouts supporting the MNO. And now, of course, it's now completely fallen apart. The fact is that the Métis National Council cannot hold a meeting now, because under the Constitution, 2 of the 3 founding members, that's the Manitoba Métis Federation, Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, Métis Nation of Alberta, those are the 3 founding nations. If 2 of those 3 have pulled out, they actually can't hold a meeting.
No, that's very interesting. And Jennifer, after the Saskatchewan Métis pullout, outgoing MNC President Cassidy Caron said unity was more important than individual issues, such as the questionability of the Métis Nation of Ontario. Is she right about that?
I think that the unity is definitely going to play into the decisions that are happening over the next little bit. I think, you know, it's really hard to say. Like I've seen Métis nations and locals over the last little bit almost butting heads over the decisions that are being made, and I think there's a lot of complexities included in this that, you know, the Métis people are navigating for the very first time. For, you know, me as a First Nations person belonging to a nation, you know, what another nation does sometimes at the end of the day can impact my nation, but we look at our sovereignty almost a little bit differently. And I think the conversation around what we look like under groups like FSIN and AFN is sometimes a little complex for us as well. And is unity always important where all of our nations are on the same page when it comes to FSIN or AFN? Or do we want collective sovereignty nation to nation? And if that's the case for Métis people, what does that actually look like? Because right now they're relying pretty heavily on the governance structures, you know, provincially, and it seems to be a little bit of a mess.
Nigan, really quickly, the Métis Nation of British Columbia says it is looking at its involvement in the Métis National Council. Only one of the founding partners is left at MNC. Is the organization dead? You did comment on this already.
It really doesn't matter what the Métis Nation of British Columbia, with respect to my relatives out in British Columbia, it really doesn't matter. They aren't a founding member, and so they don't have that kind of sway or the power within the Métis National Council to be able to bring the pieces back together, unless they're somehow build a relationship with Manitoba, which is very unlikely, or the first to pull out, or this is the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan most recently to pull out. There's a real staunch issue of identifying the Red River Métis as a national government, as a national group, involving those who come from Red River in Manitoba, but then also other affiliated Métis communities. The Manitoba Métis Federation, which is leading the charge, does recognize people who were distributed or moved as a result of way back 100 years ago of what happened for the Métis people to scatter across the prairies, both east and west. And so there is really doesn't really matter anymore. The Métis National Council, and you'll see many different tweets out there from particularly those in the Manitoba Métis Federation who have had a long struggle and conflict with the MNC, saying that the MNC is dead and there's no national movement or a national voice for the Manitoba or for the Métis Nation National Council. So the Manitoba Métis Federation and their other partners, MNO, MNC, MNS, and Manitoba Métis Nation of Alberta, that's the national government of the Métis now, the Red River Métis.
Well, Nigon and Jennifer, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you for your time.
Great, yeah, thanks.